Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, Director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Riley Roche, reporter with the Deseret News, Spencer Stokes, president of Stokes Strategies, and Robert Gehrke, news columnist with the Salt Lake Tribune. So glad to have the three of you with us this evening. And we have a lot to get into in terms of politics, but tonight we're also going to get into your brains a little bit about what's going to come over the coming months in the state of Utah and the country. But let's get right into the state's response to the pandemic, to COVID-19. Robert, let's start with you. This has been a big week in the state of Utah. We have moved officially from red to orange. Talk about what that means and a little bit about how it's going so far.
Well, I mean, the biggest thing it means is some of these businesses that were shut down before can start reopening. Restaurants can start reopening if they maintain these social distancing rules. Gyms can start opening. There's some talk about theaters, churches. The order was clarified recently to allow churches to start reopening. They still have to maintain social distancing rules. They're encouraged to wear masks, but it does start loosening up some of the restrictions. The thing that we got to be careful about, obviously, is that the virus is still out there. There's almost nobody is actually immune to this yet, and so they're going to be keeping a close eye on what this reopening means. The anticipation is when people start circulating more, start coming in closer contact with each other, we're going to see an increase in cases, and so they've got to keep a really close eye on how this unfolds.
Yeah, so Lisa, let's talk about the close eye that people are watching, because that is right. What is the goal? I mean, you've been talking to all these elected officials. You've wrote great columns about this too. What is the goal that they are looking to achieve, that they are monitoring as we go and change colors?
Well, this has been set up by a lot of folks as a choice between safety, protecting people from the spread of this virus, and opening up the economy. A lot of politicians are talking about it in those terms. And it seems as if that's really not a correct choice. People shouldn't have to choose between safety and the economy. I think the governor and others who have created this scale, red to orange to yellow to green, see it as kind of a gradual reopening of the economy, a gradual return to a more normal way of life here. But the reality is that I think there are probably a lot of people who are still concerned about getting out and interacting. There's an issue with masks, for example. Some people feel much safer wearing a mask. It doesn't protect you from other people's germs. It protects your germs from infecting other people. So it's sort of a civility, if you will. But there's also people who are uncomfortable around those wearing masks. We've seen protests, people wanting to reopen things even more. It's become politicized in a way that I think is making a lot of people uncomfortable.
Yeah, Spencer, talk about that for a second, because that seems clearly true. Who would have thought there would be politics in masks? But no doubt about it, that is happening. Talk about that and why.
Well, I call the orange level the adult, to see if we can behave like adults. Opening up, hand sanitizing, washing your hands, sneezing in your elbow, wearing masks. And yes, I think many people view the mask wearing as coming down to people who are not wearing their masks love liberty, and people who are wearing masks, want the government to tell them what to do. And I think you do see that as you talk to people. for me, I have tried to respect locations that want me to wear a mask. I have gone to a number of stores that have a sign that says stop before you enter. We'd like you to wear a mask. I go back to my vehicle, put a mask on, and go in. I believe that you should respect the store owner's wishes and the place of business that you're going into. I think from a practical standpoint, it's going to be very difficult to open churches. It's going to be very difficult to open movie theaters and cultural events where there are larger gatherings because, and we see it with restaurants. I mean, my very favorite restaurant, I think all of you know, is a local hamburger joint here in town, and they're not opening inside dining because they just don't have the space to do social distancing. But it has come down to a political issue, and I agree with that. And there's people who don't believe in the conspiracy as they see it, or there are those people who believe that people aren't wearing masks are part of the conspiracy. So,
yeah, you really do have this tug of war between the governors, and the governors in the middle of it, right? You've got the people, as Spencer's talking about, who desperately want to reopen the economy, and you have the people on the other side who are, both the health professionals by and large, and the people who are more concerned about safety and public health. And so the governor's having to try to navigate this. And I think that's where we come down to this orange, red, yellow, green scale. And it's also a regional issue. We saw St. George or Washington County this week request to move from orange to yellow already. That was denied. But I mean, there's a tension there. And we've seen politicians exploiting it, frankly. There was a rally last weekend in Vineyard where a lot of the political candidates showed up, and demanded reopening the economy more quickly. Representative Paul Ray was out sort of in front this week saying that it's time to reopen the entire state now, that this has all been an overreaction to media hype. Paul Ray, from my point of view, is wrong. I think the data shows that he doesn't know what he's talking about, but that's another story.
Well, let's bring that up for a second. Maybe Spencer, you can comment about it. I think it's worth talking about that quote from Paul Ray, which is on Facebook. Let's put it up as a graphic because I want to discuss it for just a second because it does sort of encapsulate the difference between some of the groups inside the state, but maybe in the country. But here's what he said: "It's time to stop letting panic and fear drive our policy. We need to open Utah and allow people to make their own decisions. Encourage compromised individuals to isolate, but don't bankrupt everyone else." Spencer, those are some pretty serious words right there.
It's what I call the adult phase of this, which is, we don't know what it would have been like had we all acted. I was in Best Buy just before this, the full shutdown occurred, and I was talking to one of the salespeople, asking how what had been happening in their store, and I said, I think we just all need to be very cognizant of not touching things, not hand sanitizing, washing our hands, sneezing in our elbows. And he said, "What, you mean like acting like an adult?" And I think this orange phase is really the message of, can we do this and act like adults? Because we forget that what we're trying to do is flatten the line. And that means that we don't want to overburden our hospitals. But yes, we're all going to get this eventually. But what we need to do is not have it become an overwhelming problem with our hospitals. I think a lot of people are viewing this as, okay, it's orange, we can go back to life as normal. And that's not at all what we mean. What it means is we need to gradually move into this, but people think, oh, it's over. And I think it is a dangerous situation. I do think we have to be very cautious. And I do think we have to monitor what's happening at the hospitals, because if people just go back to life as normal, it will blow up. So.
Well, a lot of the Democrats that I talked to spoke about this time as a way of rethinking the role of government. Here in Utah, a very conservative state, we tend to downplay the role of government in our lives, but it does have a role. And what could be more important than public safety? government does need to tell people what's safe and what's not. I mean, this idea that we would rely on adult behavior to protect us, I guess if everyone acted a certain way all the time, that might be the case. But we know that that's not going to happen. We know there are going to be people out there who won't wear a mask, so they're not keeping their germs from spreading. We know people are going to go out there and not social distance. We know people are going to go out there and maybe even provoke encounters that are unsafe out of some political sense of righteousness, for lack of a better word. It just seems like this is a time when we need to think about what we expect from our government. And to Robert's point earlier about the Governor Herbert sort of being in the middle of all this, I think that's exactly right. Everyone's turning to him to keep them safe, and also turning to him to fulfill some of their political goals, including returning as much as possible to the great economy we had just how many weeks ago. It's a tough position for a politician to be in, but it is what we really have government for, and that's to take the measures needed to keep us as safe as possible in a situation like this. I mean, the reality, we talk about flattening the curve, we talk about increased testing, we talk about all of these terms, but the reality is what we're trying to do is simply try to keep the population safe, as safe as possible, right?
Yeah. Well, and we're still going to have this tension that's going to last this for a couple more months. I mean, I've seen models from the University of Utah that say that before we went from red to orange, we were not going to reach the peak until early, maybe the second week of August. Now we'll reach that peak earlier, but it's also going to be a higher peak. And we're still going to have hundreds and hundreds of people who are going to need to be hospitalized over the next month and a half to 2 months. And we've got people on, as Lisa mentioned, the mask issue has become a big polarizing factor. And we heard Representative Phil Lyman last week saying the only way to get him to wear a mask is have the governor tell him that he shouldn't wear a mask because he's going to just do whatever the governor tells him not to do, or vice versa. But, Phil Lyman represents a district where there's now over 120 cases, one of the highest rates of COVID-19 in the state, largely on the Navajo Nation. But, this is an issue that we're going to be grappling with, not just for the next few weeks, but for months and months and months. And then there's potential for a spike again in fall. So this is not going away. So I think we're trying to find a way to get to some sort of new normal, to get to some sort of way of dealing with this as a chronic condition almost, rather than a critical acute one.
Hey, mine's a practical issue. How many more Sundays can I worship from home? That's really what and so I'm really praying for the lockdown to continue much longer.
Spencer, if you come over to the dark side, you don't have to go back at all.
Okay, take a second, because one of the roles of government, since Lisa and Robert both talked about this a little bit, Spencer, clearly has been overseeing the testing that's going on. Test Utah. Talk about what Utah is doing for just a moment as we wrap this up. How is that going? And is that one of the proper roles of government that Lisa was talking about for them to be overseeing?
Well, I have deep feelings about this. I feel like the worst time to do no bid contracting is during a crisis. I think we've become very lean and have the ability to do contracting very quickly in the state. And I think both Lisa and Robert have written extensively about what that's meant. Quite frankly, I'm not a fan of how they've approached the testing. I believe that hospitals are the right place to do that. I know we have a great Silicon Slopes area, and we have high-tech folks. But when it comes down to this, I believe we should leave these things to the medical professionals. If I were to have one criticism of the coronavirus task force, or our version of that in the state, I would say that it should have been led by medical professionals, and ours by and large has been. But I don't particularly need to hear from the governor or the lieutenant governor. I want to hear from the state's epidemiologist. I want to hear from the experts on the daily briefings. So I believe we could have handled a little differently the testing and had medical facilities do it rather than leave it up to the high-tech industry. I know there's been lots written about that. I personally got one of the notices as I was driving up to Logan. We did a drive-by to kind of check on all of our family, and we dropped off treats at each of their house. Didn't get out of our cars, but we drove by. And as I was driving towards the Idaho border, it about scared me enough to drive me off the road. The alert that came onto my phone. I know we've abandoned that, but as we've tried to do this, the proper role of government, I think we've learned a lot of what to do and what not to do. So medical professionals, yes. Politicians, no. That's my general state.
I'm pretty grateful, frankly, that if we're going to have politicians leading it, we have a politician that's not up for re-election. I mean, I think we talked about the pressure that the governor's under, and that would be that much worse if he was facing re-election. If he was going into the convention and going into a primary, this pressure to reopen government or the economy prematurely would have been 10 times as intense.
Yeah, and I think you have to be careful what you ask for, because I don't think this has benefited Spencer Cox in his re-election or in his election, and so I think you have to be careful what you ask for. And I believe that a lot of these no-bid contracts may come back as a reflection on he and the governor. So it is great that we don't have the governor being pressured by that, but I think people of the state of Utah are pretty bright. And when you have epidemiologists and the health department stepping up, I think we're willing to listen.
Let's talk about one of the consequences of COVID-19 is for you, Lisa, because our legislature is going to have to meet a couple more times. In fact, they've indicated to get together to talk about how to kind of jumpstart the state economy a little bit, how to direct the CARES Act funds, that they will likely be meeting in May and June. What are you hearing from them that they will likely be talking about, with a little emphasis on the budget?
That is the big issue, right? The budget. The state budget year begins July 1st. There's a $20 billion budget that was passed last session, set to take effect. Clearly, the money is not going to be there to fund $20 million worth of state spending. So the issue is, how do you go back in there and start making cuts? It is very similar to what happened during the Great Recession, when the economy sputtered and slowed dramatically. This is actually much faster and could be very deep for a while. So what they're looking at doing is coming back. There may be a special session in May for some issues, but in June they would come back and deal with budget cuts. Yeah. Later this month, the Executive Appropriations Committee of the legislature, legislative leaders are going to meet and come up with some recommendations. Those will include looking at overall cuts, 3 tiers, 2%, 5%, 10%. That's $2 billion. Out of the budget, what that's going to look like, and then they'll put that into place in a special session in June. So we go from having a huge WPU increase in per student funding of 6%, major programming, to some pretty potentially severe budget cuts.
Yeah. So Robert, talk about how they're looking at this. I mean, we have one legislator saying, hey, let's talk about the budget. It's slash and burn. That means a lot to people who rely on those state funds from education, higher education, other places.
Well, and especially with the high level of unemployment we've got now, the Medicaid budget is going to be strained. The unemployment insurance there's going to be a lot of demand for that. And I think Lisa hit on it. I think it's going to be at least 10% we're going to be looking at, more than $2 billion that's going to need to be cut. There's going to be a lot of federal funding rolling in to kind of offset, maybe soften some of that. But, this legislature is also pretty loath to taking federal funds when, we saw that during the recession, that there was some reluctance to do it. So it is going to be painful. It's going to be painful across the board, I think, particularly for education, because that's where the money is. It seems like 6 years ago now that we were arguing about tax reform. But had that gone through, the budget hole could have been even worse because we don't have any sales tax coming in right now, really, and the income tax is going to be way down. And you're also going to have this issue where they're going to be a little bit hamstrung on what they're able to do. The levers that they have at their disposal are not, none of them are good. So it's going to be painful, and it's going to be painful for a good long time. There have been models from the Gardner Center that say it's going to be a sharp dip and then hopefully a sharp rebound, but that's not guaranteed in any way, shape, or form.
I was going to add, when you talk about levers, they did anticipate toward the end of the general session that there could be some economic impact from the virus. So they looked at setting aside money in areas like new building construction, for example, ongoing money that they would be able to tap if needed. And of course, now it's needed. We're talking about several $100 million for things like a new state office building that just simply won't get started. There was also money put in place to continue the new prison construction and some road construction that normally would have been bonded for. Well, just in the last few days, the state treasurer has put together a bond, hundreds of millions of dollars to cover those ongoing, what had been funded with ongoing money for prison construction and road construction. So there is some money, probably close to maybe $1 billion, that can be redirected from other parts of the budget, but that still means a pretty significant cut in a lot of areas, as you mentioned, Robert.
So thank you for your analysis of that. We'll watch this because all these elected officials, are trying to get reelected too, which is an interesting time. So since the Hinckley Report is going to take a couple months off, this is the last episode of the season until this fall. Do you mind if we take just a moment, the last few minutes, talk about what's coming? All right, what we're not going to talk about here, but everyone should be watching. And Spencer, that governor's race has to be near the top.
I think the governor's race is near the top. It's been a roller coaster, as you can imagine, from people getting signatures to going to the convention to the governor changing how signatures could be gathered to a judge allowing a candidate to have access to the ballot and arbitrarily changing the number of signatures needed to another candidate suing to get on the ballot. The governor's race will be at least until June 30th, will be top of mind, I think, for everybody. I believe there's a great Democrat candidate in the race, but this is Utah, so June 30th will be the deadline on that to watch. The budget for the state will be a hot topic. I think further consideration of how we handle ourselves during a pandemic, during a crisis like this, is going to be top of mind. And I don't know about Robert and Lisa, but lobbying the legislature or finding out things from the legislature has become very difficult as they do an online legislative session. I don't think it's ideal for citizens to give input to their legislators. So I think that's going to be top of mind. There will be a lot of things discussed in the 2021 legislative session with a new governor, a budget in crisis, and how do we deal with executive orders and electronic legislative sessions. So I think those are going to be some of the major ones. I will say that higher education, probably the Board of Regents during the middle of this actually put together a funding package to increase tuition in most places for professor pay. I think that will go away pretty readily. But the legislature really slowed spending down, as Lisa pointed out, towards the end of the session because they saw this coming. So I think they're a little more prepared than you would think. But I've heard politicians say, or legislators say, we've had the largest funding increase this year, and we'll probably have the largest funding decrease in 1 year, which is pretty historic.
Hard to see both sides of that. Robert, what are you looking at?
I mean, I think Spencer hit on most of them. This governor's primary is going to be fascinating. 4 people, four viable candidates with a lot of money to spend, and you could see this playing out in a number of different ways. I mean, Spencer Cox could run away with it. John Huntsman could run away with it, or they could split the moderate vote. Greg Hughes could shoot right up the middle and end up taking this thing. It's going to be a fascinating one to watch. And I think the 4th District primary with Kim Coleman and Burgess Owens is going to be a really interesting one to watch come June. And as Spencer kind of touched on, how do these people even campaign over the next, next couple months? Because they're very limited in what they're able to do, and so I think that's gonna change the entire complexion of the political landscape for the next 2 months.
And don't forget the 1st District, which is a hotly contested race as well.
Yeah.
Well, the fourth
last couple seconds.
4th District was supposed to be one of the biggest races in the country. We'll see if that comes to fruition in COVID times.
Yep. Yeah. Very good analysis. We'll watch these closely. Thank you for being with us, the final episode of the season. And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. This show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you in the fall.